Some bonds run deeper than blood, forged in the wild places where civilization ends and something truer begins. In 1889, in the remote frontier town of Ash Hollow, Montana, an old mountain man named Ezekiel Zeke Crane walked down from the ridge each dawn with 6 wolves by his side, creatures so massive they seemed born from legend itself. The townsfolk whispered about him, this grizzled trapper who'd lived alone since the war, wondering if he'd gone half wild up there in the high country. Every morning he strode through the dusty main street in his fur-lined coat, the wolves padding beside him like silent guardians, their eyes glowing like embers in the early light. Some said he'd tamed them through patience. Others swore he'd made a pact with mountain spirits. But when livestock started turning up dead, the sheriff and armed ranchers had enough. They followed Zeke into the wilderness one cold morning, rifles loaded, determined to end his demon beasts once and for all. What they discovered in those high pines wasn't what any of them expected. But what was it about those wolves that made even the hardest men lower their rifles? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn broke over the Bitterroot Range like a promise whispered to the sleeping earth. Ash Hollow lay nestled in a valley where the pines grew thick and the wind carried the scent of snow even in summer. It was the kind of town that had sprung up after the war, built by men and women who'd grown weary of the world's noise and sought something simpler, something they could hold in their hands and call their own. The main street ran straight as a rifle shot from the church at the north end to the livery at the south. In between stood the essential bones of frontier life, Thornton's General Store with its wide porch and pickle barrels, the Silver Dollar Saloon where miners and ranch hands gathered to forget their aches, the sheriff's office with its 2 cells that rarely held more than a drunk cowhand sleeping off his Saturday night, and modest homes of families who'd staked their futures on this hard country. Sheriff Bill Hastings had been watching Zeke Crane make his morning walk for near on 15 years now. He stood by his office window each dawn with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands, observing the ritual that never varied. Zeke would appear at the ridgeline just as the sun touched the peaks, a tall figure in a coat sewn from wolf pelts and deer hide, his beard silver as creek water in winter. Behind him, moving with the fluid grace of smoke, came the 6 wolves. They were magnificent creatures, each one larger than any wolf Bill had seen in 30 years on the frontier. The lead wolf, the one Zeke called Ghost for the pale gray of its coat, stood near 4 feet at the shoulder. Its eyes held an intelligence that made a man's skin prickle. Then came Shadow and Storm, 2 black-furred brothers who moved in perfect synchronization. Ember had rust-colored fur that caught the morning light like copper. Dawn was smaller, faster, with silver-tipped fur that made her shimmer. And finally, the youngest, a 3-year-old called Frost, still learning his place in the pack, but already showing the size he'd grow into. They walked in formation, not quite flanking Zeke, but surrounding him in a protective pattern that spoke of years of understanding. The wolves never strayed, never threatened, never made a sound. They simply existed alongside the old mountain man. As natural as his shadow, Mary Thornton swept the boardwalk in front of her store, same as she did every morning, but her hands always stilled when Zeke passed. She was a widow of 5 years, her husband John taken by the pneumonia that swept through one bitter February. She'd kept the store running through grief and hardship, her backbone stronger than most men's in town. Unlike some of the others, Mary had never feared Zeke or his wolves. She'd seen something in the old man's eyes, a sorrow that matched her own, a loneliness that chose itself rather than had it thrust upon. Morning, "Mr. Crane," she'd call out, and Zeke would tip his hat, a gesture so brief and courtly it seemed from another age. He never stopped, never spoke more than necessary. But that small acknowledgement meant something to Mary. It meant he saw her, recognized her humanity, even as others whispered he'd lost his own. Thomas Merrick saw things differently. The rancher owned the 3-bar M spread east of town, 2,000 acres of grazing land his father had carved from wilderness. He was a hard man, made harder by the land, his face weathered like old leather, his hands calloused from a lifetime of work. He'd lost cattle over the years, to weather, to rustlers, to the simple cruelty of frontier life. But in recent weeks, something had been killing his stock, and his mind had fixed on Zeke's wolves with the certainty of a man who needed someone to blame. He stood now outside the Silver Dollar, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette, watching Zeke pass with eyes narrowed against more than the morning sun. 3 other ranchers stood with him, Pete Davidson, Carl Winters, and young Jimmy Holbrook, whose father had left him a struggling spread in debts that never seemed to shrink. They shared Merrick's suspicions, fed by fear and the practical arithmetic of men who measured their lives in livestock and loans. "Unnatural," Merrick muttered. Loud enough for his companions, but soft enough to deny intent if challenged. Man living with beasts like that, bound to bring trouble. Zeke heard, of course. A man didn't survive 15 years in the high country without ears sharp enough to catch the slide of snow before the avalanche. But he gave no sign, just continued his steady pace, the wolves moving like water around stones, aware but unbothered. The town itself was waking now. Smoke rose from chimneys as wives stoked fires for breakfast. The blacksmith, a German immigrant named Klaus Weber, was already at his forge, the ring of his hammer on anvil a familiar music. Children emerged from houses, drawn by curiosity and daring each other to get closer to the wolves. Their mothers called them back with voices sharp with concern, though Zeke had never given them cause for worry. In 15 years, not one of those wolves had shown aggression toward a human being. Zeke's cabin sat 3 miles up the mountain, tucked into a grove of lodgepole pines where a spring fed a clear pool year-round. He'd built it himself when he first came to these mountains in 1874, a man hollowed out by war and loss, seeking only silence and the company of things that didn't ask questions. The cabin was solid work, chinked tight against winter winds, with a stone fireplace and windows that faced east to catch the sunrise. Inside, he kept his life spare. A bed built from pine, a table and 2 chairs, though no one ever sat in the second. Shelves lined with books he'd carried from another life, Shakespeare and Whitman. Some Thoreau, a worn Bible his mother had given him before the war. In a wooden box beneath his bed lay a tarnished medal from the cavalry, a tin-type photograph of a woman and child, and letters written in a delicate hand that he could no longer bear to read but couldn't bring himself to burn. The wolves had been orphaned pups when he found them, their den destroyed by a rock slide 15 years back. He'd heard their cries echoing through a canyon, a sound so pitiful it had broken through the shell he'd built around himself. He'd climbed down to find them. 4 pups then, 2 more he'd found later, abandoned or lost. Something in their helplessness had called to his own, and he'd done what any decent creature would do. He'd saved them. Raising them had required patience he didn't know he still possessed. He'd studied wolves, their nature and needs, learned their language of posture and sound. He'd hunted to feed them, stayed awake through nights when they were sick or scared, taught them to trust him not through dominance, but through consistent care. They'd grown massive on elk meat and mountain air, stronger than their wild cousins, shaped by the altitude and Zeke's careful training. But they weren't pets. Zeke never made that mistake. They were wolves, wild in their hearts, and he respected that. What they shared was partnership, built on mutual need and something deeper, a recognition of kindred spirits, all of them marked by loss, all of them choosing to survive together. As Zeke completed his morning walk through town and began the climb back toward his cabin, the sun cleared the mountains and flooded the valley with golden light. The wolves ranged ahead now, freed from the constraint of human presence, playing in the morning with a joy that belied their size. Ghost remained closest to Zeke, the alpha always mindful of his duty. Zeke paused at the ridgeline and looked back at Ash Hollow spread below. Smoke rose from chimneys. People moved through their morning routines. Life continued its stubborn insistence in this hard, beautiful place. He thought about the looks he'd seen, the whispers he'd heard. He knew trouble was coming, could feel it the way the wolves sensed weather changes before The sky showed signs. He reached into his coat and felt the outline of the object he carried always. A small pouch containing that old cavalry medal. Earned in blood during a war he'd spent decades trying to forget. He'd been Lieutenant Ezekiel Crane then, leading men into battles that accomplished nothing but grief. He'd learned hard lessons about loyalty, about what men would do when pushed beyond endurance, about the bonds that formed between soldiers facing death together. Those lessons had served him well in these mountains. The wolves understood loyalty. They understood the unspoken contracts that bound pact together. In some ways, they were more honest than men, whose words often masked their intentions. As he walked toward his cabin with Ghost padding beside him, Zeke wondered if the time had finally come when words would be required, when silence would no longer be sufficient. He'd built his life on the principle of minimal interference, take care of his own, harm no one. Ask nothing of the world that had already taken so much from him, but the world, he knew, had a way of refusing to leave a man in peace. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning when Pete Davidson found one of his calves dead in the north pasture. The animal had been torn apart with a violence that turned Pete's stomach, and he'd seen plenty of death in his years working cattle. This was different, savage and thorough, the kind of killing that spoke of hunger or rage or both. By Wednesday, Carl Winters had lost 2 yearlings. By Friday, young Jimmy Holbrook discovered 3 of his breeding heifers slaughtered near the creek that marked the boundary of his property. The pattern was unmistakable, or so it seemed to men looking for patterns. The kills moved from east to west, from the higher pastures down toward the valley, and they were getting bolder, closer to the barns and houses where families slept. Thomas Merrick called the meeting for Sunday after church services. The town gathered in the modest building that served as both house of worship and community hall, its pine pews filled with worried faces. Reverend Samuel Morrison, a gentle man whose faith had been tested by frontier hardships, opened with a prayer for guidance and wisdom. Then he stepped aside, knowing that what followed would have little to do with Scripture. Merrick stood at the front, his hat in his hands, but his jaw set with determination. "We've all heard about the killings," he began, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. 15 head of cattle in 2 weeks. That's money we can't afford to lose. That's food for our families, security for our futures. We need to address this before it gets worse. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the congregation. Mary Thornton sat in her usual pew, third from the front, watching the faces around her with growing concern. She saw fear there, yes, but also something more dangerous, the eagerness of people who wanted a simple answer to a complicated problem. "Now, I'm not one for jumping to conclusions," Merrick continued, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But facts are facts. These killings started 2 weeks ago. Every morning for 15 years, we've watched Zeke Crane walk through town with 6 wolves bigger than any natural animal ought to be. Wolves are predators. It's their nature to kill." Sheriff Hastings stood from his seat near the back. "Hold on, Tom. In 15 years, those wolves have never touched anyone's livestock. Why would they start now?" "Maybe they got a taste for easy meat," Merrick shot back. "Maybe the old man's lost control of them. Maybe he's lost his mind up there in the high country. Hell, Bill, maybe he's doing it deliberate, turning them loose at night to hunt while he plays innocent during the day." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Several people shifted uncomfortably. The idea that Zeke might be deliberately setting his wolves on them transformed the situation from misfortune to betrayal, from natural predation to malice. "That's a serious claim," Sheriff Hastings said quietly. "You got any proof?" "I got dead cattle," Merrick replied. "I got tracks around the kills. Big tracks, bigger than any wolf I've seen except Zeke's. I got families scared their children might be next." "That enough proof for you?" Mary Thornton stood, her voice calm but firm. "Those tracks could belong to mountain lions. We've had them come down from the high country before when winter's been hard. And spring was late this year. Could be they're hungry. Could be," Pete Davidson spoke up from his seat. "Could also be wolves. Mary, I respect your charitable nature, but we can't afford to guess wrong on this. My family depends on that herd, so we should accuse a man without evidence, Mary challenged. Zeke Crane has been nothing but peaceable all the years he's lived here. He keeps to himself, bothers no one. Now we want to blame him, because it's easier than admitting we don't know what's killing our stock. I'm not talking about blaming, Merrick said, though his tone suggested exactly that. I'm talking about investigating. Let's go up there, take a look at those wolves, see if there's blood on them. If they're innocent, fine. But if they're the ones doing this, then we deal with it before someone gets hurt worse than losing cattle. The debate continued for another hour, voices rising and falling with the tide of emotion. Some sided with Merrick, mostly the ranchers who'd lost stock, men whose margins were thin enough that these losses meant real hardship. Others urged caution, reminded the assembly of Christian charity and the danger of mob justice. The town was fracturing along lines of fear and principle, and Sheriff Hastings could feel his authority slipping as the crowd's mood darkened. Finally, Reverend Morrison called for order. Perhaps, he suggested in his mild way, we should invite Mr. Crane to speak for himself. Let him answer these concerns directly. He's here, a voice said from the back of the hall. Heads turned. Zeke Crane stood in the doorway, his tall frame backlit by the afternoon sun. He'd entered so quietly that no one had noticed, a skill learned in war and perfected in wilderness. He wore his usual attire, buckskin pants, wool shirt, the fur-lined coat that marked him as different from the town-dwelling folk. His grey beard was neatly trimmed, his eyes the colour of winter sky, calm and assessing. He walked down the centre aisle, his boots making soft sounds on the wooden floor. People drew back slightly as he passed, not from fear exactly, but from an instinctive recognition that here was a man who existed by different rules. He stopped before the assembly, removed his hat and waited. Sheriff Hastings spoke first. Zeke, there's been some trouble. Livestock killings. Some folks are concerned about your wolves. Zeke's gaze swept the room, taking in Merrick's hostile stance, Mary's sympathetic expression, the fear and uncertainty in the faces of his neighbors. When he spoke, his voice was roughened by years of disuse, but still carried the educated diction of a man who'd once read law and poetry. My wolves don't kill cattle, he said simply. They hunt elk and deer in the high country. They've never descended to the valley to hunt. They have no need and no inclination. How can you be sure? Merrick demanded. They're animals. You can't control what they do when you're not watching. I can be sure, Zeke replied, because I know them. I've raised them from pups. I know their habits, their nature, their territories. What you're describing, the pattern of kills, the savagery, that's not wolf behavior. Wolves kill clean and efficient. They don't waste meat or kill more than they need. Then what's doing it? Pete Davidson asked, genuine curiosity mixing with his worry. I don't know, Zeke admitted, but I can track it. Give me 2 days, I'll find your killer. Why should we trust you? This from Jimmy Holbrook, the youngest of the ranchers, his voice tight with the stress of debts and dead cattle. Zeke turned to look at the young man. In 15 years, have I given you cause not to? The question hung unanswered. It was true that Zeke had never caused harm, never stolen, never threatened. His only crime was his strangeness, his choice to live apart with creatures that civilized people feared. But fear, as Sheriff Hastings knew, often outweighed truth. Merrick stepped forward. Here's what I propose. Tomorrow morning, a group of us, armed and legal, with the sheriff leading, we follow you up to your place. We take a look at those wolves. If they're clean, if there's no sign they've been hunting cattle, then we look elsewhere. But if we find evidence they're involved, we put them down. All of them. And you don't interfere. The ultimatum was clear. Zeke could feel the weight of it, the implicit threat behind Merrick's words. This wasn't just about cattle anymore. This was about power. About whether a man could choose to live differently and be left in peace, or whether the community would enforce conformity through force. He could refuse, could walk out and let them come if they dared. But that would only delay the inevitable, and it might result in bloodshed. These were frightened people, not evil ones. They deserved better than violence born of misunderstanding. I'll guide you, Zeke said finally. You'll see the truth. But you come unarmed except for the sheriff and one deputy. I won't have a dozen rifles pointed at creatures who've done no wrong. And you follow my lead in the high country. It's dangerous terrain for men who don't know it. Merrick started to protest, but Sheriff Hastings intervened. That's fair, Tom. We're investigating, not staging an execution. Zeke's terms are reasonable. After more debate, a compromise was reached. 8 men would make the trek. Sheriff Hastings, his deputy John Reeves, Merrick, Davidson, Winters, Holbrook, Mary's brother-in-law Robert Thornton, who worked as the town's surveyor, and Klaus Weber, whose strength and level head made him a natural choice. They would leave at dawn, armed but not aggressive, and they would see for themselves what truth lay in the high country. As the meeting broke up, people filed out into the afternoon sun, their conversations low and worried. Mary Thornton caught Zeke's eye as he prepared to leave. "Be careful," she said softly. "Some of them are looking for an excuse, not an explanation." Zeke nodded once, replaced his hat and walked out into the street. The wolves were waiting for him at the edge of town where he'd left them, patient as stones. Ghost stood as Zeke approached, and the others followed suit, reading his mood in the set of his shoulders, the tension in his stride. "Tomorrow," Zeke told them quietly, "we'll have visitors. You'll need to trust me and they'll need to trust you. Between those two things lies the only chance we have." The wolves watched him with their amber and yellow eyes, understanding in their own way that something had shifted, that the careful balance of their existence had been disturbed. As they walked back toward the mountain, the sun setting behind the peaks, Zeke felt the weight of what was coming. He'd spent 15 years avoiding exactly this, the moment when his past and present collided, when the solitude he'd built would be invaded by the very world he'd fled. But there was no avoiding it now. Tomorrow would bring revelation one way or another, and Zeke Crane, who'd spent so long in silence, would finally have to speak his truth to men who might not want to hear it. The men stayed in the valley through midday, and in those hours their understanding of Ezekiel Crane transformed completely. Martha invited them to share lunch, simple fare of bread and venison stew, but offered with a hospitality that spoke of gratitude rather than obligation. As they ate, seated on rough-hewn benches outside the main cabin, the full story emerged, in pieces, shared by different voices, each adding their thread to the larger tapestry. Zeke himself spoke little, but when pressed by Sheriff Hastings, he finally revealed the genesis of his mission. He rose and walked to his cabin, smaller than the others, set slightly apart, and returned carrying a wooden box worn smooth with handling. From it, he withdrew a faded photograph mounted on tin. "My wife, Catherine," he said, his voice steady but distant. "And our daughter, Emma. She was 4 in this picture." The photograph showed a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a small girl with her mother's smile. The men passed it carefully between them, handling it with the reverence such artifacts deserved. "We came west in 73, Zeke continued. "I'd served in the cavalry, survived the war, thought I could build something good out here. We had a homestead in the next valley over. Good land, clear water. We were happy." He paused, and in that silence the men could feel the weight of what was coming. Winter of 74 hit early and hard. I'd gone to Fort Benton for supplies, a 3-day journey. Catherine and Emma were to stay with neighbors, but the storm came up sudden. They tried to make it to the neighbor's place, less than 2 miles, but in a whiteout, distance means nothing. I found them 4 days later after the storm cleared. They'd gotten turned around, ended up going deeper into the mountains instead of down. Froze to death within sight of a cave that would have sheltered them. Klaus Weber crossed himself quietly. Pete Davidson looked away, his own losses reflected in Zeke's. "I buried them in spring," Zeke continued, "and I blamed myself. If I'd been there, if I'd taught Catherine better navigation, if I'd built the homestead closer to town, 1,000 ifs that changed nothing. I couldn't save them, but I thought maybe I could save someone else's wife, someone else's daughter." "That's when you found the wolf pups," Sheriff Hastings said, understanding dawning. "That summer," Zeke confirmed. Their den had collapsed. They were starving, too weak to even cry properly. I saw myself in them, orphaned by circumstances beyond control, facing death unless someone intervened. So I intervened. And as I raised them, as I taught them to survive, I realized they could help me do what I couldn't do alone. He gestured to where Ghost lay in the sun, the massive wolf's eyes half closed but still watchful. Wolves can range farther than a man, faster, through terrain that would kill a horse. Their senses are sharper. They can hear a person calling for help from miles away, smell a campfire through a snowstorm. I trained them not to hunt people but to find them, to seek out those who were lost or hurt or dying in these mountains. And when they find someone, Robert Thornton asked, they come back and lead me to them, Zeke said. Or if the person is mobile, they'll guide them here. The wolves know this valley is safe. They bring people home. Sarah, the young widow, spoke up then. My baby was dying, she said, her voice quiet but firm. We'd been stranded 3 days. Our fire had gone out. I'd given up hope, was just holding her, trying to keep her warm with my body. Then I heard howling. I thought they were going to kill us, but they didn't. One of them, the silver one, Dawn, she lay down next to us, sharing her warmth. The others howled until Mr. Crane came. He carried us both here, got my baby warm, fed her goat's milk until she could nurse again. She's 2 years old now, healthy and happy. Without him, without those wolves, she'd be dead and I'd be dead, and no one would have ever known we existed. The testimony continued. Each person in the valley had a story, and each story reinforced the same truth. Zeke Crane had built something remarkable here, a network of salvation for people the world had forgotten or failed to notice. But it was more than rescue. The valley had become a community, however temporary for some. The women taught each other skills, sewing, cooking, preserving food. The men maintained the cabins, hunted under Zeke's guidance, learned to live with the land rather than against it. The children, traumatized by their various ordeals, found healing in the simple rhythms of mountain life. How do you sustain it? This from Thomas Merrick, his practical rancher's mind grappling with the logistics. Food, supplies, medicine. I hunt, Zeke replied. The valley provides some. Berries, roots, fish from the stream. I trade pelts in Fort Benton far enough away that no one connects them to Ash Hollow. Buy what we need. Flour, salt, medicine, tools. It's not luxury, but it's survival. And the people who leave? Deputy Reeves asked. Where do they go? Martha answered this one. Some return to family once they're strong enough. Others start fresh in new towns where their tragedies aren't known. Mr. Crane helps with that, gives them enough supplies to make a new beginning, sometimes accompanies them to the railroad. He asks only one thing, that they don't speak of this place, Sheriff Hastings guessed. That they live, Zeke corrected. What they say or don't say is their choice. But most understand that this valley's value lies in its secrecy. It's a place, outside the normal world, where people can heal without judgment or obligation. The revelations stirred something in Thomas Merrick that he'd kept buried for years. He stood abruptly, walked to the edge of the clearing where the stream ran clear over smooth stones. The others gave him space, recognizing a man wrestling with his own demons. After several minutes, he returned, his weathered face showing the tracks of tears he hadn't bothered to hide. I had a son, he said quietly. Jacob. He ran off 7 years ago after we had words, harsh words about his future, about the ranch, about becoming a man. He was 16, said he was heading to California to make his own way. I never heard from him again. He looked at Zeke directly. All this time I've been angry at you, suspicious of you, thinking you were some kind of threat. Truth is, I was jealous. You saved all these people, gave them second chances, and I couldn't even save my own boy, couldn't keep him from running, couldn't find him afterward. Every stranger I see, part of me hopes it's Jacob coming home, and it never is. The confession hung in the mountain air, raw and honest. Los Weber moved to stand beside Merrick, a silent gesture of support between men who understood that hardness was sometimes just armor against pain. "I'm sorry about your cattle," Merrick said to Zeke. "About my accusations, I was wrong." "You were scared," Zeke replied. "Fear makes us see threats where none exist, makes us forget that the world's harder on most folks than we realize." "The mountain lion," Sheriff Hastings said, bringing them back to practical matters. "We still need to deal with it." "We will," Zeke confirmed. "But there's something else you need to know first. Something that threatens not just the cattle, but this valley and everyone in it." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, worn from handling, marked with official seals and stamps. 3 weeks ago, I found this nailed to a tree at the valley's southern approach. It's a mining survey claim, filed with the Territorial Office. Consolidated Mining Company is claiming mineral rights to this entire area. Robert Thornton took the document, his surveyor's expertise immediately recognizing the legal language and the implications. "This can't be," he muttered, tracing the boundary descriptions with his finger. "This land was never opened for mineral claims. It's federal territory, designated as—" He stopped, his face paling as he read further. "They've falsified the survey data. These coordinates are deliberately wrong. They're claiming land that was supposed to be protected." "Protected how?" Pete Davidson asked. "Watershed protection," Robert explained. "This valley feeds 3 major streams that supply water to half the ranches in the territory, including yours, Pete. If they mine here, they'll poison the water with tailings and mercury. It's not just about saving refugees. This valley is essential to everyone downstream." The weight of this revelation settled over the men like snow. What they'd thought was a simple case of livestock predation had become something far more complex, a threat to their entire way of life. Disguised in legal paperwork and corporate ambition. "They're coming, aren't they?" Sheriff Hastings said. Zeke nodded. "Surveyors first, then construction crews. I've been tracking them. That's what displaced the mountain lion. They've been blasting in the high country, destroying denning sites, driving the wildlife down into areas where they conflict with humans. The lion killing your cattle is just the beginning. When they start full operations, it'll be worse. Can we stop them?" Jimmy Holbrook asked, his voice carrying a desperate hope. "Maybe," Robert Thornton said slowly, studying the document. "If this survey is fraudulent, if we can prove they've manipulated the claims process, we can challenge it. But we'd need evidence, time, and resources. And they have lawyers and politicians in their pocket. Then we better get started," Merrick said with sudden determination. "Because I'll be damned if I'm letting some mining company poison my water and destroy what this man has built." The journey back to Ash Hollow felt different than the ascent. The men rode in contemplative silence, each processing what they'd witnessed, their understanding of their world fundamentally altered. What had begun as a mission to eliminate a threat had become something else. Entirely a call to defend something precious, against forces they'd barely comprehended. The sun was setting by the time they reached town, painting the valley in shades of amber and gold. As they dismounted outside the sheriff's office, a small crowd gathered, anxious for news. Mary Thornton stood on her store's porch, her face showing the strain of a day spent worrying. Sheriff Hastings addressed the crowd. "We found the source of the livestock killings. It's a mountain lion, driven down from the high country by mining operations. Zeke's wolves had nothing to do with it." Relief and confusion rippled through the assembled townspeople. Questions flew. Where was the lion now? How could they protect their herds? What mining operations? "There's a town meeting tonight," Hastings continued. 8 o'clock. "Everyone should attend. We have information that affects us all." As the crowd dispersed, murmuring among themselves, Merrick approached Zeke, who stood slightly apart with his wolves. The rancher extended his hand. "I owe you more than an apology," Merrick said. "I owe you my respect. What you've done up there, what you've built, that takes a kind of courage I'm not sure I possess." Zeke took his hand. "You showed courage today. Admitting you were wrong takes more strength than being right, my son," Merrick said quietly. If he's still alive, if he's out there somewhere struggling, I hope someone like you finds him. Gives him the help I couldn't. Maybe he'll find his own way home," Zeke offered. People have a way of surviving, even when we think they can't." The meeting that night filled every seat in the church hall. Sheriff Hastings stood at the front with Robert Thornton, who'd spent the afternoon reviewing his survey maps and mining regulations. The fraudulent claim document lay on the table before them. Hastings began by recounting the day's discoveries: the hidden valley, the refugees, the wolves' true purpose. Gasps of surprise and murmurs of amazement greeted each revelation. When he finished, he gestured to Robert. "The mining claim is the real threat," Robert explained, unfolding a large map across the table. Consolidated Mining Company has filed paperwork claiming mineral rights to the entire Upper Valley. If they proceed, they'll use hydraulic mining and mercury amalgamation. The runoff will poison every stream feeding into Ash Hollow. He traced the watercourses with his finger. "Your wells, your irrigation, your livestock water, all of it comes from this watershed. Within 6 months of full operations, the water would be unsafe. Within a year, it would be deadly." The room erupted in angry voices. These were people who'd built their lives on this land, invested everything in ranches and farms that depended on clean water. The mining company's plans represented existential threat, not just to Zeke's hidden valley, but to the entire community. "Can we fight it?" This from Mary Thornton, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We can try," Robert replied. "The survey data is fraudulent, I can prove that. The land designation was manipulated. I have records showing the original watershed protection. But legal challenges take time and money. The company has both. We have neither. We have something they don't," Zeke said from the back of the room. All heads turned to him. "We have the truth. And we have people willing to stand for it." "Pretty words," someone called out. "But words don't stop corporations." "No," Zeke agreed. "But laws do. If we can get the territorial governor to review the case, if we can present evidence of fraud, the claim can be nullified. But we need time to build that case, and the company won't wait." "How long before they start operations?" Sheriff Hastings asked. "Based on what I've seen," Zeke replied, "they're already preparing. Another week, maybe 2, before they bring in the heavy equipment." Klaus Weber stood. "Then we delay them. Give Robert time to build his legal case. Make it difficult for them to work, expensive to proceed." "How?" Pete Davidson asked. "Peaceful resistance," Klaus said. "I saw this in the old country. Workers striking, citizens protesting. We don't have to attack them, just slow them down, make them reconsider whether this valley is worth the trouble." The discussion continued for hours, ideas flowing and colliding. Some advocated for confrontation, others for pure legal action. Gradually, a strategy emerged, multi-pronged and risky but possible. Robert would document the survey fraud and prepare a formal complaint to the territorial governor. Mary would coordinate a letter-writing campaign to newspapers and politicians, making the company's actions public. Klaus would organize the able-bodied men to establish a watch on the valley approaches, ready to slow any company equipment that appeared, and Zeke, with his intimate knowledge of the terrain, would track the company's preparations, providing intelligence on their movements and intentions. What about the refugees? Sarah Johnson, who'd come down from the valley with her husband, asked. "Are they safe?" "For now," Zeke said. "But if the company discovers them, they'll use it against us. Say I'm harboring squatters on land, they claim. We need to be prepared for that." "Let them try," Merrick said with sudden fierceness. "Those people have more right to be there than any mining company. They're survivors, not squatters." Agreement rumbled through the crowd. The town that had been ready to condemn Zeke and his wolves that morning now stood unified behind him. Fear had been replaced by purpose, suspicion by solidarity. As the meeting broke up near midnight, people lingered in small groups, still talking, planning, committing to action. Mary caught Zeke on his way out. "You've given us something to fight for," she said. "Not just the valley or the water, but the idea that some things matter more than profit. That people matter more than ore." "People always mattered more," Zeke replied. "Sometimes it just takes a threat to remember that." He left town with his wolves, climbing back toward the high country under a sky brilliant with stars. Behind him, the lights of Ash Hollow glowed warm against the darkness, a community awakened to its own strength, prepared to defend what it had built together. But Zeke knew the fight ahead would test them all. Corporations didn't yield easily. Men motivated by greed were often more dangerous than any predator. The mountain lion that had killed the cattle was a simple threat, one that could be tracked and dealt with through patience and skill. The Consolidated Mining Company was something else entirely, an adversary with resources, connections, and a ruthlessness that came from seeing land and people as nothing more than obstacles to profit. Stopping them would require more than courage. It would require sacrifice, and Zeke had learned long ago that sacrifice came with a cost. He wasn't sure his neighbors understood yet, but they would learn. One way or another, they would all learn what it meant to stand against power when you had nothing but principle to sustain you. 3 days later, the Consolidated Mining Company made its presence known in dramatic fashion. A convoy of wagons rolled into Ash Hollow at noon, led by a gleaming black carriage that seemed grotesquely out of place in the dusty frontier town. From it emerged a man in an expensive suit, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, his bearing that of someone accustomed to having doors opened and questions answered. His name was Harrison Blackwell, Senior Acquisitions Manager for Consolidated Mining. He carried with him an air of Eastern refinement and Western ruthlessness, a dangerous combination that had made him successful at securing mineral rights across the territories. Sheriff Hastings met him in the street, along with a crowd that had gathered at the sound of the wagons. Blackwell smiled pleasantly, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. "Sheriff," he said, extending a hand that Hastings didn't take, "I'm here on behalf of Consolidated Mining Company to inform you that we'll be beginning operations in the Upper Valley within the week. We wanted to make contact with local law enforcement to ensure a smooth transition." "Transition to what?" Hastings asked, his voice carefully neutral. "To prosperity," Blackwell replied smoothly. "We'll be bringing jobs, money, development. Your little town stands to benefit enormously from our presence. We pay fair wages, buy local supplies where possible, and contribute to community development. At what cost?" Mary Thornton called from the crowd. Blackwell turned toward her, his smile never faltering. "I'm sorry, miss, I don't understand the question. We follow all territorial regulations, pay our taxes, and—" "You're planning to mine the upper watershed," Robert Thornton interrupted, pushing forward. "That water feeds this entire valley. Your operations will poison it." "That's a rather alarmist view," Blackwell said. "Modern mining techniques are quite safe. A little sediment, perhaps, but nothing that would harm anyone. Mercury amalgamation," Robert countered. "Hydraulic sluicing? Those aren't safe techniques. They're destructive and toxic." Blackwell's pleasant demeanor cooled slightly. "You seem well informed. May I ask your credentials, Mr. Thornton?" "I'm a surveyor, and I've reviewed your claim. The survey data is fraudulent. The coordinates are deliberately falsified to circumvent watershed protection regulations." For the first time, Blackwell's smile disappeared entirely. "That's quite an accusation. I hope you have evidence to support it, because defamation of a territorial corporation is a serious offense." "I have evidence," Robert said firmly, "and I've filed a complaint with the Territorial Governor's office." Blackwell was silent for a moment, reassessing the situation. This wasn't the simple frontier town he'd expected to steamroll with promises and legal papers. These people had organized, educated themselves, prepared to fight. "I see," he said finally. "Well, I'm sure the governor's office will find our documentation in perfect order. In the meantime, we have legal rights to proceed, and we intend to exercise them. I'd hate for there to be any unpleasantness." The threat was subtle but clear. Sheriff Hastings stepped forward. "As long as your people obey the law, there won't be any trouble. But if you attempt to access disputed land before the governor's review is complete, I'll be forced to intervene." "On what grounds?" Blackwell challenged. "Trespassing, if nothing else," Hastings replied. "That land is occupied. There are people living there." Blackwell's eyes narrowed. Squatters have no legal standing. If there are unauthorized settlers on company land, we have every right to remove them. They're not squatters, Zeke said, his voice cutting through the crowd as he emerged from behind the general store where he'd been listening. They're residents of a legal homestead. All eyes turned to him. Blackwell assessed Zeke with the calculating gaze of a man evaluating an obstacle. And you are? Ezekiel Crane. The land you're claiming includes my homestead. Filed with the Territorial Office in 1874. I'm not aware of any valid homestead claims in that area, Blackwell said. Dismissively, that's because your people made sure the records disappeared, Zeke replied calmly. But the claim exists, properly filed and maintained. Do you have proof? It was the question Zeke had been dreading and preparing for. The truth was, his original claim papers had been lost in a fire that destroyed part of the Territorial Office in 1881. He'd assumed the loss was accidental, but now, seeing Blackwell's confident smile, he understood it had been deliberate. The company had been planning this for years, systematically eliminating obstacles to their claim. Before Zeke could respond, Mary Thornton spoke up. I have proof. Every head swiveled toward her. She stood on her store's porch, holding a leather-bound ledger. My father, Samuel Crane, was the Territorial Land Office clerk from 1872 to 1883. He kept duplicate records of every filing, personal copies, in case the official documents were lost or damaged. When he died, his records came to me. She descended the steps, holding the ledger like a sacred text. I went through them last night, looking for Mr. Crane's homestead filing, and I found it. She opened the ledger to a marked page, holding it out so Robert Thornton could examine it. He studied the entry carefully, his eyes widening as he read. This is it, Robert confirmed. Filed September 14th, 1874. Legal description matches the valley coordinates. Witnessed and notarized. This is a valid homestead claim. Blackwell moved quickly, trying to see the entry, but Mary closed the ledger and held it close. This stays with me, she said firmly. But I'll be providing certified copies to the territorial governor, along with Mr. Thornton's survey documentation. For the first time, Blackwell's composure cracked. His jaw tightened and something dangerous flickered in his eyes. That ledger is private property, he said. It has no legal standing. Wrong, Robert replied. Duplicate records maintained by a territorial official have full legal standing, especially when official records have been destroyed or tampered with. This proves Mr. Crane's claim predates yours by 15 years. The crowd murmured with excitement. They'd expected confrontation, maybe violence, but this was a victory of paper and proof, of careful preparation, meeting corporate overreach. But Blackwell wasn't finished. He smiled again, though this expression was colder, more calculating. Very clever, he said, but you're missing something crucial. Even if Mr. Crane has a valid homestead claim, homestead law requires continuous occupation and improvement of the land. Has Mr. Crane lived on this property continuously since 1874? The question hung in the air. Everyone knew Zeke lived in his cabin in the mountains, but they'd also just learned about the hidden valley. Had he lived there specifically or elsewhere? Zeke met Blackwell's gaze steadily. I've maintained a residence in the valley continuously since filing the claim. I've improved the land, built structures, cleared fields, established water rights. The law requires occupation and improvement. It doesn't specify how many days per year you must physically sleep there. Can you prove this occupation and improvement? Blackwell pressed. I can, Martha said, stepping forward from where she'd been standing at the crowd's edge. She'd come down from the valley that morning, bringing several other refugees with her. I've lived in Mr. Crane's valley for 3 years. The main cabin was built in 1874. You can see the date carved in the foundation beam. There are 4 other structures, a working well, cleared fields, and established trails. Mr. Crane has maintained and improved that property continuously. Other voices joined hers, Dutch, Sarah, the Johnsons, all testifying to the valley's structures, to Zeke's continuous presence and improvements. Their testimony painted a picture of a legal, maintained homestead that predated any mining claim by more than a decade. Blackwell listened with growing frustration. His simple acquisition had become a legal quagmire, complicated by a hermit with better documentation than expected and a town united in opposition. "This isn't over," he said finally. "We have lawyers, resources, and political connections. We'll challenge this claim and we'll win. In the meantime, I'm authorized to make a generous offer. Mr. Crane, we'll purchase your homestead for $5,000, far more than that mountain land is worth for farming or grazing. You can relocate, help your friends, find other accommodations, and everyone walks away satisfied." $5,000 was a fortune by frontier standards. The crowd fell silent, waiting for Zeke's response. It was enough money to resettle the valley refugees comfortably, to buy land elsewhere, to start over, without the threat of corporate violence hanging over them. Zeke was quiet for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "The valley's not for sale." "Don't be foolish," Blackwell said, his patience finally exhausted. "We can take it by force if necessary. We have the legal right to access our mineral claims. If you stand in our way, you'll be arrested, and your homestead will be forfeit." "Take the money while you can." "No," Zeke repeated simply. Blackwell's face hardened. "Then you're making a serious mistake. We start operations Monday morning. Anyone who interferes will face the full consequences of the law. Sheriff, I trust you'll do your duty and ensure safe passage for our workers." He turned and strode back to his carriage without waiting for a response. The wagons followed him as he left town, heading north, toward the mountain passes, toward the valley. As the dust settled, Sheriff Hastings turned to face the assembled townspeople. "We have 4 days," he said. 4 days to make our case to the territorial governor and get a judgment. Robert, can you prepare the documentation that quickly?" "I can try," Robert replied. "But even if I get it submitted, there's no guarantee the governor will review it in time." "Then we need a backup plan," Klaus Weber said. "Ways to delay them peacefully if they try to force their way in." "I'll handle that," Zeke said quietly. "The valley has only 2 approaches that can accommodate equipment. I know how to make them impassable without violence. That could be considered obstruction," Sheriff Hastings warned. "So could poisoning a watershed," Zeke replied. "Sometimes you have to choose which law to break." The crowd began to disperse, people breaking into smaller groups to plan and prepare. Mary Thornton held the ledger close, understanding that it had become the most valuable object in town, proof of a claim that stood between corporate greed and community survival. As Zeke prepared to return to the valley, Thomas Merrick approached him one final time. "You could have taken that money," the rancher said. "Started over somewhere safe." "Some things aren't for sale," Zeke replied. "That valley saved me after I lost my family. It's given refuge to dozens of people who had nowhere else to go. Letting a mining company destroy it for silver, that would be betraying everything Catherine and Emma meant to me. I'd rather die defending it than live knowing I sold it." Merrick nodded slowly, understanding in a way he hadn't before. "Then we'll stand with you, whatever comes." As Zeke walked toward the mountains with his wolves, the sun setting behind him, he allowed himself a moment of gratitude for the transformation that had occurred. He'd lived alone for 15 years, trusting no one, expecting nothing. Now he had allies, people willing to risk their own security for a cause larger than themselves, but he also understood the price that might be demanded. Harrison Blackwell wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. The next few days would determine whether principle could triumph over power, whether a handful of frontier settlers could stand against a corporation backed by territorial politicians and unlimited resources. The wolves sensed his mood, pressing closer as they climbed. Ghost looked back at him once, yellow eyes questioning. Zeke reached down and touched the great wolf's head. "We'll see it through," he promised. "Whatever it takes." The next 4 days passed in a blur of preparation and growing tension. Robert Thornton worked 18-hour days, compiling evidence, cross-referencing survey maps, and preparing a comprehensive legal brief that documented every instance of fraud in the mining company's claim. Mary organized a relay system, with riders ready to carry the documentation to the territorial capital the moment it was complete. Meanwhile, Zeke prepared the valley for a siege that might never come, or might arrive with devastating force. He'd lived through enough war to understand the principles of defense, control the approaches, establish fallback positions, maintain supply lines, and never underestimate your opponent's willingness to escalate. The valley had two viable entrances for heavy equipment. The hidden pass they'd used on their first visit was too narrow for wagons, but it could admit men on foot. The southern approach was wider, following an old game trail that wound through the foothills. Both would need to be defended or blocked if the mining company forced the issue. On Saturday morning, Zeke stood at the southern approach with Klaus Weber, Thomas Merrick, and a dozen other men from town. They'd brought axes, saws, and ropes, tools for honest labor that could also serve defensive purposes. "We dropped trees across the trail," Zeke explained, pointing to strategic points along the route. "Not enough to be permanent barriers, but enough to require days of work to clear. We make it expensive and time-consuming for them to bring in equipment. Won't that just make them angrier?" Young Jimmy Holbrook asked. His financial situation hadn't improved, but his perspective had shifted dramatically after seeing the valley and understanding what was at stake. "Probably," Zeke admitted. "But it buys Robert time to get the legal challenge filed. Sometimes the best you can do is slow down the inevitable and hope circumstances change." They worked through the day, selecting massive pines that stood close to the trail. Zeke's knowledge of the forest was encyclopedic. He knew which trees were healthy enough to fall cleanly, which were compromised by rot or beetle damage, how to direct their fall using strategic cuts and rope tension. The wolves ranged ahead, serving as early warning sentries. If company scouts approached, Ghost would signal with a specific howl that Zeke had trained into him years ago. But the day passed without incident, and by sunset, 3 enormous pines lay across the southern approach, their branches interlocked in a barrier that would require significant effort to remove. "It's not permanent," Merrick observed, "but it'll slow them down. That's all we need," Zeke replied. "A few days can make the difference between legal protection and corporate conquest." That night, back at his cabin, Zeke did something he hadn't done in years. He descended into the small root cellar beneath the floor and retrieved a long wooden case, its surface scratched and weathered by decades of storage. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay his cavalry saber. He unwrapped it slowly, the metal catching the lamplight. The blade was still sharp. He'd maintained it over the years, with the automatic care of a soldier who'd learned that equipment neglect could mean death. Engraved on the guard were his initials and his rank, Lieutenant E. Crane, 7th Cavalry. He'd carried this saber through a dozen battles, had used it to save lives and take them. Looking at it now brought back memories he'd spent 15 years trying to bury. The thunder of hooves, the screams of wounded men, the particular smell of gunpowder and blood that no amount of time could fully erase from memory. He'd promised himself after Catherine and Emma died that he'd never fight again, never raise a weapon in anger or war. But defending the valley wasn't war, it was protection. And sometimes, he reflected, a man had to break his own promises to honor a deeper truth. Sunday brought news that changed everything. A rider arrived from the territorial capital, not with the governor's response, that would take days yet, but with information Robert had requested through his professional contacts. Harrison Blackwell, it turned out, wasn't just an acquisitions manager. He had a history of securing mineral rights through intimidation, fraud, and when necessary, violence. In Nevada, a homesteader who'd refused to sell had died in a suspicious fire. In Colorado, a town that resisted had seen its water supply mysteriously contaminated, forcing evacuation and allowing the company to purchase land at distressed prices. The pattern was clear. Blackwell didn't accept defeat. He created circumstances that made resistance impossible. Sheriff Hastings called an emergency meeting in his office Sunday evening. Zeke, Robert, Mary, Klaus, and the other key defenders gathered around his desk. "We need to be realistic," Hastings said, his face grave. "Blackwell won't play by rules. If he can't get what he wants legally, he'll create a crisis that forces our hand. We need to be prepared for sabotage, false accusations, maybe violence against our people. We should post guards," Klaus suggested. "Protect our families." "Already organized," Hastings confirmed. "But I'm more worried about what happens at the valley. If Blackwell can provoke an incident, make it look like you attacked his workers, Zeke, he can use that as justification to bring in territorial marshals, maybe even federal troops. So what do we do?" Mary asked. "We document everything," Robert said. "Photographs, if possible. Multiple witnesses, written statements. Make it impossible for him to fabricate a narrative. And we don't engage," Zeke added. "If his men come, we slow them with barriers, but we don't physically confront them. We make our stand legal and moral, not violent." "What if they don't care about legal or moral?" Merrick asked bluntly. "What if they come with guns looking for a fight?" The question hung heavy in the room. Zeke met each person's eyes in turn, seeing the fear and determination there, the recognition that they'd committed to a course that might demand more than they'd anticipated. "Then we defend ourselves," Zeke said quietly. "But we don't initiate. We don't give them the excuse they're looking for." Monday morning dawned cold and clear. Zeke stood at the valley's southern approach with 20 men from town and the valley's refugees. They'd built a simple barricade from the fallen trees, not to completely block passage, but to mark a clear line that said, "This far and no further." The women and children had been evacuated to Ash Hollow under Sheriff Hastings's protection, despite their protests. Martha had wanted to stay, to defend what she'd helped build, but Zeke had been firm. "If this goes badly," he'd told her, "we need witnesses who can tell the true story. That's more important than having more bodies on the line." The wolves patrolled the perimeter, their presence both reassuring and unsettling to the defenders. These massive creatures, so gentle with the valley's children, now appeared as what they truly were: apex predators, loyal and lethal, prepared to defend their territory. Around mid-morning, Ghost's warning howl echoed through the valley. The company was coming. They arrived in force, 3 heavily loaded wagons carrying mining equipment, escorted by a dozen armed men who had the hard look of hired guns rather than legitimate workers. Harrison Blackwell rode in the lead, sitting his horse with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no in a way that stuck. He reined in about 50 yards from the barricade, his eyes sweeping over the defenders. Zeke stood at the center, flanked by Klaus and Merrick, with the wolves arranged protectively nearby. "Mr. Crane," Blackwell called out, his voice carrying easily in the mountain air, "I gave you fair warning. This land belongs to Consolidated Mining Company. You're trespassing on corporate property. Stand aside or face the consequences. This land is protected by a legal homestead claim," Zeke replied, his voice calm but firm. "Until the territorial governor rules on that claim, you have no authority to proceed." "I have every authority," Blackwell countered. "Our legal team has reviewed the matter. Your supposed claim is invalid due to lack of continuous occupation. The territorial court will rule in our favor, and this delay is costing my company money. Now move aside." "No." The single word hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Blackwell's face darkened. "I'm trying to avoid bloodshed," he said. "But my men are armed and authorized to protect company interests. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Be reasonable." "We're armed too," Klaus said, though none of the defenders had drawn weapons. "And we have the law on our side." "The law is what powerful men say it is," Blackwell replied with naked cynicism. "And I'm more powerful than a collection of dirt farmers and a crazy hermit." Before Zeke could respond, one of Blackwell's hired guns raised his rifle and fired, not at the defenders, but at Ghost. The shot was deliberate, meant to kill the alpha wolf and break the defenders' morale, but Ghost was already moving before the trigger squeezed, his predator's instincts sensing danger a heartbeat before it manifested. The bullet passed harmlessly through space where he'd been standing. The entire pack erupted in response, not attacking, but forming a defensive wall between the defenders and Blackwell's men. Their growls, a rumbling promise of violence held barely in check. "Control your animals!" Blackwell shouted. That was an act of aggression. "My men have the right to defend themselves." "Your man fired first," Zeke said, his voice now edged with cold anger. "Unprovoked attack on a defensive position. Sheriff Hastings is witnessing this from the ridge." He gestured to where, indeed, the sheriff sat his horse on the overlooking hillside, along with 3 others documenting every action. "You try to claim self-defense, and you'll hang for murder." Blackwell glanced toward the ridge, his face twisting with frustration. He hadn't expected witnesses, hadn't counted on the defenders being smart enough to document the confrontation. His plan to provoke an incident had backfired. "This isn't over," he said finally. "We'll be back with proper legal authority. Territorial marshals, a court order, whatever it takes. Enjoy your little victory, because it's the last one you'll have." He wheeled his horse and led his men back down the trail, leaving the defenders tense and shaken but intact. As the sound of hooves and wagon wheels faded, Klaus let out a long breath. "That was too close," he said. "That was a probe," Zeke corrected. "He wanted to see how we'd react, whether we'd break discipline and give him an excuse. He'll come back better prepared, with legal cover and more men." "We won this round, but the fight's just starting." Robert Thornton rode up from where he'd been watching with Sheriff Hastings. "I got photographs," he said, holding up a camera he'd borrowed from the town's portrait photographer. "Clear documentation of who fired first, who was threatening whom. This will help with the governor. If we get it to the governor in time," Mary added, having ridden up with Robert. "Blackwell's probably sending his own version of events by fast courier right now. Then we better send ours faster," Merrick said with grim determination. That night, as the defenders maintained watch, Zeke sat alone, with his saber lying across his knees, Ghost's massive head resting on his boot. The confrontation had awakened something in him he'd thought long buried, the tactical mind of a cavalry officer, the strategic thinking that had kept men alive in combat. He'd spent 15 years running from that part of himself, hiding in the mountains, avoiding the conflicts and complications of human society. But the valley and its refugees had pulled him back into the world, given him something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Blackwell wouldn't accept today's defeat quietly. The man had resources, connections, and a willingness to cross lines that decent people wouldn't consider. The next confrontation would be more dangerous, the stakes higher, the outcome less certain. But Zeke was done running, done hiding. The valley had become more than a refuge. It had become home to people who depended on him, who'd placed their trust in his ability to protect them. He wouldn't betray that trust, no matter what it cost. He looked up at the stars emerging in the darkening sky, the same stars that had watched over this land for millennia. Somewhere up there, he imagined, Catherine and Emma were watching too, seeing him finally become the man he should have been when they were alive, not running from pain, but standing firm against injustice. "We'll hold," he promised the night and the valley and the memory of his lost family. "Whatever comes, we'll hold." The sun was an hour from setting when the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the valley, not from Blackwell's camp, but from the trail leading back to Ash Hollow. Every head turned as a rider appeared, pushing his horse hard up the slope. It was Deputy Reeves, and he was waving something over his head as he rode. "Telegram!" he shouted. "Telegram from the territorial governor." The young deputy practically fell from his horse in his excitement, thrusting the paper toward Marshal Garrett. The marshal took it, read it carefully, then read it again, his expression shifting from skepticism to surprise to something like relief. "Well," he said finally, "this changes things." He turned to face both groups, the defenders at their barricade and Blackwell with his hired guns. "By order of Governor Benjamin Thompson, all mining operations in the Upper Crane Valley are hereby suspended, pending full investigation of fraud allegations. The Consolidated Mining Company's claim is placed under judicial review. Furthermore," he paused, looking at Blackwell with undisguised satisfaction, The Territorial Attorney General has issued a warrant for the arrest of Harrison Blackwell on charges of document falsification, bribery of territorial officials, and conspiracy to defraud. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Blackwell laughed, though it was a bitter, defeated sound. "You think this matters?" he said. "We have lawyers who will tie this up in courts for years. We have politicians who owe us favors. This is a temporary setback, nothing more." "Maybe," Marshal Garrett said, pulling handcuffs from his belt. "But right now you're under arrest, and these people get to keep their home while the courts figure out who's lying and who's telling the truth." As Garrett moved to arrest Blackwell, two of the hired guns reached for their weapons. But they never cleared leather. The wolves, reading the threat in their movements, surged forward with a speed that defied their size. Ghost placed himself between the gunman and Zeke, his growl a rumbling warning that needed no translation. "Don't," Garrett commanded the gunman. "You pull those weapons and there's no legal protection for you. Stand down." The hired guns looked at their employer, now being cuffed, then at the wolves, then at the defenders who'd endured their intimidation for days. Slowly, carefully, they raised their hands in surrender. "Smart choice," Klaus Weber said. The arrest happened quickly after that. Blackwell was placed in Garrett's custody to be transported to the territorial capital for arraignment. The hired guns and mining crews were ordered to pack up and leave, their contracts with the company now meaningless without Blackwell's authority. As the marshal prepared to depart with his prisoner, he approached Zeke. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I'm glad I didn't have to arrest you. What you've built here, the refuge, the community, that's worth more than any amount of silver in the ground." "Thank you for giving us time," Zeke replied. "That extra time to sunset, that's what let the telegram arrive." Garrett allowed himself a small smile. "I've been enforcing orders long enough to know the difference between law and justice. Sometimes a lawman's job is to delay the former long enough for the latter to catch up." As the marshal's party departed with Blackwell in custody, the defenders stood in stunned silence, processing their unexpected victory. Then someone, Jimmy Holbrook perhaps, let out a whoop of joy, and suddenly everyone was celebrating, shaking hands, embracing, laughing with the relief of men who'd prepared for the worst and received the best. But the celebration was interrupted by another arrival. Sheriff Hastings returned from his ride to town, accompanied by Mary Thornton and a man none of them recognized, a young fellow, perhaps 23 or 24, with the weathered look of someone who'd been living rough. The stranger's eyes swept the valley, taking in the cabins, the defenders, the wolves, then settled on Thomas Merrick. His face, hidden behind a beard, showed a mixture of hope and fear. "Pa," he said quietly. The single word froze Merrick in place. He stared at the young man, his face cycling through disbelief, hope, and dawning recognition. "Jacob?" His voice broke on the name. "It's me, Pa. I heard about the trouble here, heard about Mr. Crane and the valley. I was working a claim in Idaho when the news reached us. Took me 4 days to get here." Jacob took a tentative step forward. "I know I left wrong, said things I shouldn't have. But when I heard you were standing up to a mining company, defending people who needed help, I had to come back. Had to see if maybe there was room for me again." Merrick crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and pulled his son into an embrace that 7 years of separation and pride had denied them both. Both men were crying, unashamed of the tears that came from wounds finally healing. "There's always been room," Merrick said roughly. "Always. I'm sorry I made you think there wasn't." The Valley defenders watched this reunion with their own tears, understanding that they'd won more than a legal battle today. They'd won the validation of principles that held communities together: loyalty, forgiveness, the courage to admit mistakes and seek reconciliation. As the sun finally set behind the peaks, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, Zeke stood slightly apart with his wolves, watching the celebration. Ghost leaned against him, the great wolf's warmth solid and reassuring. "We did it," he murmured to his pack. "We held the line." The wolves, in their way, understood. They defended their territory, protected their pack, both the 2-legged and 4-legged members. They'd fulfilled the purpose Zeke had trained into them 15 years ago, and in doing so had proven that his faith in them was justified. Mary Thornton approached, carrying the ledger that had been so crucial to their legal case. "Your father would be proud," Zeke told her. "Those duplicate records saved us. He always said truth was worth preserving," Mary replied, "even when it seemed like no one cared." Today proved he was right. Around them, the valley came alive with the sounds of people who'd won not just a battle, but validation of their belief that some things, community, justice, compassion, mattered more than profit or power. The refugees could return home. The town's water was safe, and a man who'd hidden from the world for 15 years had rediscovered his place in it. It was, Zeke reflected, as close to a perfect ending as life ever offered. Not without cost or struggle, but earned through courage and sustained by principle. The kind of ending that, had Catherine and Emma lived to see it, would have made them proud of the man he'd become. 3 months later, spring had fully claimed the Montana mountains. The valley had transformed from the stark beauty of early season to the lush green of summer approaching. Wildflowers dotted the meadows in riots of color, lupine and Indian paintbrush, columbine and yarrow. The stream ran clear and cold, its water untainted by mining chemicals, flowing down to nourish the ranches and farms of Ash Hollow as it had for centuries. Zeke stood at the valley's southern entrance, watching as workers from town installed a new sign. They'd carved it from a massive piece of lodgepole pine. The letters burned deep and clear, Crane's Haven. Beneath, in smaller script, a sanctuary founded 1874. The name had been the townspeople's idea, voted on at a community meeting where Zeke's objections had been overruled by unanimous consent. If the valley was going to be known, and after the confrontation with consolidated mining, secrecy was no longer possible, then it should carry the name of the man who'd protected it. "It's good," Thomas Merrick said, standing beside Zeke. "Solid work. Should last 50 years or more. Seems permanent," Zeke observed with a mixture of pride and discomfort. "That's the idea," Merrick replied. "This place is permanent now. Legal, recognized, protected. You've built something that'll outlast all of us." The legal resolution had taken weeks of hearings and investigations, but the outcome had vindicated everything they'd fought for. The Territorial Attorney General had uncovered a pattern of fraud spanning multiple claims, with Harrison Blackwell at the center. He was now serving 5 years in territorial prison, and Consolidated Mining Company had been fined heavily and banned from operations in Montana Territory. More importantly, the investigation had led to reforms in how mining claims were processed and verified. Robert Thornton's documentation had become a template for preventing future fraud, and he'd been appointed as a special consultant to the Territorial Surveyor's Office. The valley itself had been formally designated as a protected homestead and humanitarian refuge. Zeke's legal claim was not only validated, but expanded to include provisions for maintaining the sanctuary function. The territorial government had even provided a small annual stipend to support the refuge's operations, an acknowledgement that what Zeke had built served a public good. But the most significant change was in relationships. The valley was no longer secret, and that openness had transformed it into something larger than one man's mission. Ash Hollow had embraced the refuge, with families volunteering supplies, time, and skills to support it. A rotating group of townsfolk came up monthly to help with maintenance, bringing news and connection. Martha still lived in the valley, having found her permanent home there, but she no longer felt isolated. She'd become the unofficial coordinator, managing the flow of supplies and communication between the valley and town. Dutch had stayed as well, his prospecting days behind him, content to help with hunting and maintenance. Sarah and her daughter had moved to town but visited often, the little girl calling Zeke uncle, with the unself-conscious affection of a child who knew safety when she found it. New refugees still came, travelers caught by late storms, families displaced by hardship, individuals needing time to heal from trauma. But now they arrived through a network of referrals, with sheriffs and clergymen from across the territory knowing about Crane's Haven and directing those in need toward it. What had been a secret had become a recognized institution, and its legitimacy made it more effective at its mission. The wolves had become local celebrities of sorts. After the confrontation, stories had spread about the massive creatures who'd stood guard over the valley. Artists came from as far as Denver to sketch them. A journalist from the territorial capital had written a feature article, "The Wolf Guardian of Montana." Children in Ash Hollow no longer ran from them, but begged their parents for permission to visit and see the famous wolves. Ghost, now approaching old age for a wolf, seemed bemused by the attention, but tolerated it with dignified patience. The younger wolves, particularly Frost, who'd grown into his massive size, enjoyed the interaction, their socialization with humans complete and comfortable. On this particular spring morning, Zeke had a special visitor. Mary Thornton rode up the trail, her horse sure-footed on the now well-traveled path. She carried a basket covered with a cloth, and her expression held a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. "Brought you lunch," she said, dismounting with practiced grace. "Thought you might be tired of your own cooking." They sat on a bench outside Zeke's cabin, the same bench where he'd sat alone for 15 years, but now shared easily with another person. Mary unpacked the basket, fresh bread, cheese, smoked ham, and a pie that filled the air with the scent of apples and cinnamon. As they ate, they talked about the valley's needs, the new families expected to arrive, the legal paperwork that still required attention. But beneath the practical conversation flowed an undercurrent of something else. A connection that had been building through the months of crisis and resolution, tested by stress and validated by shared purpose. "I've been thinking," Mary said carefully, "that the valley needs someone here full-time besides you. Someone to help manage the administrative side, coordinate with town, handle the details that take you away from what you do best." "Makes sense," Zeke agreed. "Did you have someone in mind?" "Me," Mary said simply. "I'd like to move up here, help run the refuge properly. My brother can manage the store. He's been wanting more responsibility anyway. And up here I could—" She paused, gathering courage. "I could be useful. Make a real difference." Zeke was quiet for a moment, understanding what she was offering and what she wasn't saying directly. After 15 years of solitude, the idea of permanent companionship was both appealing and terrifying. But Mary wasn't asking him to replace Catherine or to forget his past. She was offering partnership in the present, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "The valley would benefit from your presence," he said carefully. "And so would I." Mary's smile was answer enough. They sat together as the afternoon sun warmed the valley, watching as children from the newest refugee family played with Dawn and Frost under Martha's watchful supervision. The wolves were gentle, patient, allowing the children to climb on them and pull their fur with the tolerance of creatures who understood their role as guardians extended to providing comfort and joy. Thomas Merrick arrived later with his son Jacob, both men now working together to rebuild their relationship while helping to supply the valley. Pete Davidson came too, bringing news that the cattle killings had stopped. The mountain lion had been tracked and relocated to higher country where mining hadn't disturbed the ecosystems. Evening approached and the visitors prepared to return to town. Zeke stood with his wolves and watched them go. Ghost leaned against him, the old wolf's warmth familiar and comforting. The others ranged nearby, content and at peace. He thought about Catherine and Emma, as he did every day, but the grief had transformed. It would never disappear, that wasn't how loss worked. But it had become something he carried, rather than something that carried him. Their memory had driven him to create something good from tragedy, to save others because he couldn't save them. The valley thrived. The refugees found healing. The town had rallied to protect something worth defending. And Ezekiel Crane, who'd come to these mountains to hide from life, had discovered that life had followed him anyway, demanding he engage, connect, and build. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, he allowed himself to believe that he'd finally fulfilled the promise he'd made to himself 15 years ago, not to forget his family, but to honor them by becoming the kind of man they'd believed him to be. A protector, a builder, a man who stood firm when others needed strength. The wolves sensed his peace and shared it, their soft breathing the only sound in the valley's gathering darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new refugees needing help, new responsibilities to fulfill. But tonight, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Ezekiel Crane was home, and home finally was enough.